Okay, so if you did complete the homework, or even if you didn't, if you're able to pull up a copy of the assignment so we can go over it. I'll give everybody a second to do that while I pull up the answer key, and then we'll get started. Okay, so the answer key for this assignment, for some of the questions, especially the ones at the bottom about the macromolecules, there are multiple correct answers. This is just what I was looking for, kind of the most straightforward answer. So for the element that we have here, oxygen, number 1 is the atomic number, which is 8. Number 2 is the element symbol, which is O. Number 3 is the element name, oxygen. And number 4 is the average atomic mass. So the atomic mass listed below is like an average of all of the isotopes. So oxygen's most common isotope would be the mass that is 16 grams per mole. But obviously, there are certain versions of oxygen that are less. They have fewer neutrons, and some have more. So that's why we have 15.999. If you ever use it in calculations, you'll use 16. You'll never have to type this out. Okay, for the macromolecule questions, we've got carbs. The monomer of a carb is a monosaccharide. Lipids, we've got fatty acids and glycerol. Nucleic acids are nucleotides, and proteins are amino acids. So I saw on some of your guys' homework assignments that you ended up, for example, with nucleic acids, you would write nucleotides and RNA or DNA. This is just a heads up, RNA and DNA, and then for the proteins, the secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structure. All of those would not be considered monomers. Monomers refer to like the smallest unit of the macromolecule, which would be these listed. 2 examples of monosaccharides, you could put any combination of glucose, fructose, and galactose. There are others as well, but these were the ones that I had listed on the slide. For number 3, saturated fatty acids have the maximum amount of hydrogen, whereas unsaturated have double bonds and therefore fewer hydrogen. You could have put different things like staying solid at room temperature versus liquid, all of those, but these are, like I said, the most straightforward. What does DNA stand for, and what about RNA? DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid, and RNA is ribonucleic acid. This one was pretty easy. 5, which nucleotides are purines and which are pyrimidines? Purines are adenine and guanine. Pyrimidines are cytosine, thymine, and uracil. Some of you didn't put all 3 for pyrimidines, and that's kind of, it's not a big deal as long as you get the difference between the two, which is number 6. Purines have 2 rings while pyrimidines have 1. How many structures constitute proteins? That was all straightforward. 4. In which structure of a protein features an alpha helix or a beta pleated sheet, which is the second structure. Okay, I kind of went really, really quickly through all of that, and I'm trying to find the chat. Okay, does anybody have any questions about the homework? You can go ahead and either type your questions in the chat or just unmute yourself. Yeah, I'll give about a minute. Question 1, yes. Okay. Okay, anybody else? Like I said, feel free to unmute if you have a question during the presentation itself. You can turn your videos on. Honestly, anything's fine. Just as long as you're not talking. If you're not talking, try and keep yourself on mute. Okay, Then that's all for the homework for this week. You will have another homework assignment that's due on the 27th, so next Monday. And that is on the Google Classroom already, and I will post an assignment for it right after this class is over. Okay, so I mean, it's been 15 minutes. I'm pretty sure we can go on to the presentation now. So, let's see. Pull up the chat so I can have that up there. All right. So last week we talked about the periodic table briefly, and we went into macromolecules. So the periodic table was more chemistry, and the macromolecules was kind of the basis for biology. So now we're going to cells, water, and pH. pH is probably the most chemical of this lecture, cells being the most biological. Water kind of falls between the two, but they all interact with each other. Yeah, they all interact with each other. Okay, so we'll start with cells, which I'm sure a lot of you, if you've taken biology, or even if you haven't, you know what a cell is. But let's just talk a little bit about cells. So cells are one of the most basic biological units of life, and every known organism is composed of cells. You're probably thinking, what about bacteria and things that are unicellular? They're still composed of cells, it's just they are a cell. But yeah, every known organism has at least one cell. Cells feature smaller components known as organelles, mitochondria, Golgi apparatus, endoplasmic reticulum. You can name them for quite a while. And cells organize to form the human body in this way. So you'll start off with the individual cell, and then a bunch of cells will congregate to form tissues. Tissues will come together to form organs, and your organs will come together to form a system. For example, the system pictured right here is your cardiovascular system, with your heart being one of the organs and your lungs being another organ. And these organs are formed by tissues, and these tissues are formed out of cells. So you can call the cells, oh, these are the heart cells, oh, these are the lung cells, and each cell that is part of a tissue organ system will have a specific name. For example, you probably heard of something like kidney cells or liver cells. So yeah, they do have distinct names that relate to their distinct function. So for example, if you were thinking of like pancreatic cells or liver cells, those probably have a lot of, they focus a lot on the breaking down of glucose and other molecules that your body needs for digestion. So those cells' main function, they would have a lot of like mitochondria and such to break down a lot of the nutrients that your body gets. Okay, so there are two main types of cells. You have animal cells and plant cells. So animal cells don't need to worry about food production or structure, so they are a little bit different from plant cells, which include various organelles to support food production and structure. So these two cells are eukaryotic cells. We also have prokaryotic cells, which are bacterial cells and others, but those are kind of more biology related, so we don't really need to talk about those as much. So we're just going to focus on these eukaryotic cells. So in an animal cell, I listed some of the organelles earlier, but you can see kind of the rough, I guess, shapes of these various organelles. For biochemistry, the most important organelle would probably be something like the mitochondria, because it goes, it's home to a lot of chemical processes that are very important to chemistry. However, they are biological processes, so that's why you would talk about them in biology versus in chemistry. Okay, so let's keep going. Here we have a plant cell, and the difference between the animal cell and the plant cell, if you can see, the most notable thing is probably the shape of a plant cell. Can anybody tell me some features that you would find in a plant cell that you wouldn't find in an animal cell. It can be organelles, it can be like structurally, or yep, anything. I mean, there's obviously, you've got some names here, but yeah, I'll give you a few seconds, either unmute yourself or type it into the chat. So yeah, I've got cell wall from a lot of people, and yeah, that's probably the most obvious one. If you look at the animal cell, it's only got a membrane, but in the plant cell, it's got something outside of the membrane in the darker green, which is the cell wall. And the cell wall is really important in plant cells because it is a structural unit for a plant cell. If you think about yourself, your skin is more, it's durable, but it also doesn't retain shape as well as, say, the stem of like a flower. So that is why plant cells have such an envelope around them, because they need that structure. So then there's also a vacuole is bigger in a plant cell. Yes, if you look right here, you have a central vacuole in a plant cell, and that is really important also for the structure. It creates tension and pressure on the plant cell to maintain its shape. And chlorophyll, yes, you're gonna find chlorophyll in a plant cell within the chloroplasts, and that is because plants, as I'm sure you know, make their own food, whereas we humans do not make our own food, we just process it. Okay. And this is the last thing. It's actually very, very important. And in here, you can see kind of the chemistry to do with a lot of cellular processes. So here we have ATP and ADP. So ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is an essential molecule to humans and plants. It is our energy. We can create ATP through the breakdown of glucose, and plants do the exact same thing. So though plants make their own food, they make the sugar in chloroplasts, and then that sugar is broken down into ATP in the plant cell's mitochondria. And whereas we only do the second part, we only break it down. So ATP is incredibly, incredibly important for our cells. Nearly any cellular process that requires energy will take that energy in the form of ATP. Even the production of ATP requires ATP. So the text that's right here is kind of irrelevant. It's really deep into the chemistry of it. But the main point that you have to realize is you can see in the name, I think I can annotate. Yeah, you can see in the name triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate has a phosphate group, and that is really, really important. Well, it's got 3 phosphate groups, but that is really important because if you look at adenosine triphosphate and adenosine diphosphate, you can see it on the screen, but can somebody tell me the difference between the two, like the main difference? Anybody? It's really, really, really obvious. Think of like the prefix.
Is it like more phosphate versus less?
Exactly. And if you look at the prefix, can you tell me exactly how much more phosphate that adenosine triphosphate has?
2 more?
1 more, actually.
1 more.
So adenosine triphosphate has 3 phosphate groups, while adenosine diphosphate has 2. So the reason that ATP is such an amazing source of energy is because of the phosphate and the phosphate bonds. So if we look at the 3 groups, pretty sure that it would be, that was bad. So this right here is 1 group, this is another group, and this is your 3rd group. So then if we go down here, this would be 1 group, and this would be the 2nd group. So this bond right here between the P and the O is incredibly, incredibly unstable. And the reason ATP is so useful is because that unstable bond, when broken, releases a ton of energy. So you can see in the text, the conversion of ATP to ADP as illustrated yields about 7.3 kcal per mole of ATP. So this breaking apart, this breakdown of ATP into ADP is what drives cellular processes like the creation of glucose or the breaking down of glucose, which is really just essential to everything that your cell does. It's kind of it for this, but do remember this bond situation here. It will appear on your homework. Okay. There we go. There we go. Okay, so some questions I want us to talk about before we go on to water is number one, which lipid is involved in the membrane surrounding cells? Does anybody remember that from the last lecture? Does anybody have an idea? Maybe from like personal knowledge? Yeah, so Sarah, I'm not gonna say your name right. Oh my God, I'm really bad with names. But she got it right. It is a phospholipid. So I wonder if I can go back. Okay, I don't think it's gonna let me go back. But, oh, Sarah. Okay, that's a lot more straightforward. Okay, so the lipid involved in the membrane surrounding cells is indeed a phospholipid. And the reason that phospholipids are used in membranes is because of their semi-permeable nature. So does anybody know what semi-permeable means? It only lets certain molecules in. Yes, that is entirely correct. So the semi-permeable membrane that surrounds the plant cell and animal cell only lets certain molecules in and only lets certain molecules out. That ensures that all of the good stuff, like the organelles that are essential, ATP and glucose, they stay within the cell. And it also allows the cell to regulate what leaves the cell and comes in. So if your cell is processing glucose and that's its main job, it's probably not going to want a whole bunch of other molecules coming in and disrupting that, right? So the semi-permeable membrane allows all of the proteins littered around the membrane to determine what comes in and what goes out. And the phospholipid barrier, which kind of serves to isolate everything within the cell from what's outside the cell, it's got the hydrophilic heads on the outside, which like the water, and the hydrophobic tails on the inside, which means that molecules like water will never be able to make it through the membrane unless intentionally doing so. Okay, and then which carb monomer is broken down by mitochondria? I think I might have said that. Is the second answer a monosaccharide? Well, it is definitely a monosaccharide, but what specific type of monosaccharide? Does anybody know? Think what you would think about if you were something sweet, sugar. But what's it called? Like chemically. Anybody? Glucose. Yep, glucose. You got it. So glucose is broken down by mitochondria, and it is our source of energy. It provides ATP and a few other byproducts that we come by through the breakdown. Also provides energy for us. So yeah, glucose. Let's keep going. Oh, does anybody have any questions on cells before we keep going? I'll give you guys like a minute to either say them or type them. Nope. Okay, let's keep going then. So water. So I'm pretty sure everybody here knows about water. I'm sure you've already had some today, but water is essential to life. It transitions between three states depending on temperature and pressure. We've got ice, water, and water vapor or gas, a molecule made up of hydrogen and oxygen atoms. As you can see in this really, really adorable photo that I found and had to put somewhere on this presentation. And it dissolves substances like sugar and salt, covers around 71% of the Earth's surface, and I'm sure we've all learned the water cycle in early elementary school. So let's go more in depth. So here we have multiple water molecules. The oxygen molecule is in red and the hydrogen molecules are in gray. So we've got multiple different bonds and interactions within the molecule and also in between different water molecules. So within the molecule, there are covalent bonds between the oxygen and the hydrogen, as well as hydrogen bonds between two molecules and London dispersion forces. So we'll talk about London dispersion forces and hydrogen bonds in a second. First, let's talk about covalent bonds. So covalent bonds are some of the strongest bonds. However, bonds are on a spectrum. So if you were to think of covalent bonds being the strongest, there are also really strong covalent bonds and really weak covalent bonds. These are referred to as polar and nonpolar. So a really strong covalent bond is one where the charges are dispersed evenly, if that makes sense. So, oh my gosh. Let's go back to this. Sorry, is it normal for everybody now? Okay, yeah, I think we're good. Okay, so yeah, nonpolar bonds are those that are even, the charges are evenly dispersed, whereas polar bonds feature more uneven dispersion. So the covalent bond you see in water molecules is polar. There is a more negative charge around the oxygen atom and more positive charges around the hydrogen atoms. So the less non-polar a bond is, the weaker it is. The more likely it is to break apart, and the more likely the different atoms within the molecule are to attract other polar molecules. Yeah. The bonds within a water molecule are actually very similar to ionic bonds, which are permanent yet weak bonds in the sense that they're very easy to break. If you think about salt NaCl, that is an ionic bond. Okay, so these covalent bonds in water are very ideal and very important to water because different water molecules can form hydrogen bonds then. Because we have such a strong positive charge around the hydrogen atom and such a strong negative charge around the oxygen atom, atoms from one water molecule can attract atoms from another molecule, forming these hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds are generally more weak. However, they are very strong within water because of the polarity. And then last, we have London dispersion forces, which are kind of found in any polar molecule because they're very, very hard to explain without going into a lot of chemistry. But you can think of them as like moments, and these moments occur when you have a positive charge near a negative charge, and sometimes they feel attraction, but then they'll move away and it'll disappear. Either way, they're really important regardless of how fleeting they are. Okay, so next. So what makes water itself so essential? Even though we need it to live, it's also really important for a lot of different reasons. So water has a relatively low melting point and a relatively high boiling point. It has a very high heat capacity, which is different from the previous bullet point. We'll talk about it a little bit more. It is a universal solvent and it's got high surface tension. So the surface tension is a little bit more advanced chemistry, but the surface tension and the boiling point kind of go hand in hand because the molecules at the surface of the water, so think of like water in a cup or in a bowl, in a pot on the stove, I think is the best way to think about it. So obviously you're gonna have those molecules right at the top of the water, at the surface of the water. Those would be the molecules that would vaporize first, regardless of the liquid. Stuff at the top is gonna turn to gas the quickest. So all of these molecules are bound together due to the high surface tension and the hydrogen bonds is kind of the essential part. So because of the hydrogen bonds and London dispersion forces, the molecules at the surface of the water are kind of really tightly bound to each other, tightly bound to the molecules below them. And because of that, it is a lot harder to boil water and make it and turn it into vapor. That is why you have such a high boiling point. And the surface tension is a product of the hydrogen bonds and London dispersion forces. And then the last thing is water is more dense as a liquid than as a solid. This is probably the easiest concept to visualize. Think of like ice skating on a lake. The ice floats to the top. Ice is the solid form of water, yet it floats when in water. And the reason that is incredibly important is think about what life would be like if it were the opposite, if ice sank. Imagine the ocean's freezing over, so think of like Antarctica or the Arctic. Imagine if all the ice was at the bottom and it froze upwards. Would anything really be able to survive there? What do you guys think? Anyone?
Wait.
Oh, okay. um, kind of. We do need water for a lot of cellular processes, but think of it more as like just like in a lake. So think of like a freshwater lake where you have a whole bunch of fish. You can like picture the watering holes that a lot of people would use and such. So if the ice froze and it was more dense than water, then the ice would go to the bottom of the lake. And if it froze upwards, the entire lake would freeze. However, because ice is less dense, it floats exactly. Because ice floats, organisms can survive under the ice. And that allows us to make a lot more use out of the water that's on our earth and our oceans. All right, let's keep going. So going back to the idea of surface tension and how water is sticky, there are two different types of, I guess, sticky water, I guess is the best way to put it. But we've got cohesion and adhesion. So cohesion is the clinging of like molecules, and you can think of it as like water beads or drops. If you go outside and you see the rain falling, how it sticks together instead of just, I mean, rain doesn't really fall in individual molecules, right? It falls together. So that would be a product of cohesion. And then we've got adhesion, which is the clinging of unlike molecules. And this is more of a biological, it's more important biologically, but we have capillary action. So plants get their water from the ground, from the earth. And what happens is that water travels up through the stems and through the roots and into the stems and the leaves. Now, the way that it goes against gravity is through capillary attraction. For example, if you were to stick a straw into a glass of water and you were to look at it at, put your eye at the level of the surface of the water, you would see that there is essentially more water. Water would be higher up in the straw than it would be on the surface of the cup. And that is, yes, a result of adhesion and capillary action. Okay. So does anybody have any questions on water before we move to the last part, pH? Oh, I accidentally clicked the slide, but yeah, anybody got questions? Questions on covalent bonds. What exactly about covalent bonds?
Like how it's formed and like what it is exactly.
Mhm.
I don't understood that part.
Yeah, don't worry about it. I'm not 100% sure how much more depth will go into bonds, but yes, covalent bonds are generally found in biology. They're really important to biology more so than ionic bonds because covalent bonds are more permanent. And in biology, we need permanence. Okay, so covalent bonds, if you think back to, let's say, the hydrocarbon chains, between the carbon and the hydrogen and even the carbon and the carbon, they are covalent bonds. And so with covalent bonds, with any bonding actually, it's a matter of interaction between the electrons of an atom. So if you picture an atom, you have the nucleus and then the electrons revolving around it. So if you think of multiple atoms, you have multiple nuclei and multiple electrons surrounding the nucleus. So any bond will be an interaction between the two electrons of separate atoms. So you can think of this in terms of water as an attraction between the electrons of the oxygen atom and the electrons of a hydrogen atom. So a covalent bond is one in which the electrons are shared between the two atoms. So the two atoms are, you can think of them as like irreversibly joined. Obviously, it's reversible with a lot of energy, but think of it as irreversibly joined. They're sharing these electrons so that they complete their valence shell. This is like really deep in chemistry, so I don't want to go that far. But they share their electrons, and that's why they stay together. However, when you have a really, and this word is incredibly important, electronegative atom, such as oxygen, that atom attracts electrons very readily. Like it's like, you can think of it as like a magnet in a sense, but it really draws those electrons. And that's why we have a polar covalent bond, because the oxygen atom will pull the hydrogen's electron constantly. So hydrogen is generally most of the time without an electron and therefore very positive. Oxygen is not the only electronegative atom. If you have a chance to pull up a periodic table, you'll see that in the top, sorry, I'm bad at left and right, in the top right corner, oh, it's very, very hard to explain where it is. But if you look for the oxygen atom and then you see chlorine, fluorine, and a few others below it, all of those are really electronegative. Fluorine would be the most electronegative atom, but oxygen is incredibly electronegative, very, very electronegative. Okay, maybe we'll go through like a periodic table and a lot more chemistry later. I feel like you guys are interested in that, so that might be cool. Okay, so to keep going onto pH. So pH is an abbreviation for power of hydrogen. So looking at the image below, which is actually kind of a terrible hint now that I look at it, but can anybody give a guess at what power of hydrogen really means?
The first.
The first? What do you mean? Oh, the first power. Okay. Okay, we're running, I'm running a little bit over time, so I'm going to kind of go through this really quickly. If you guys have questions, we'll definitely cover this next week. Attracting atoms to get them to be bonded and the first power. Okay, so I like the first power. I'm assuming that you were looking at this from like a mathematical standpoint, so like powers of 10, powers of 8, stuff like that. And then attracting atoms to get them to be bonded. Okay, that is not quite, and that's why I think that this picture was very misleading. But yeah, I like the idea of powers. So yes, pH is power of hydrogen, and pH is a very, very mathematical concept, which I don't want to talk about because if you don't have the right math background, it'll be very difficult to understand. But looking at it from a conceptual standpoint, pH is an analysis of the amount of hydrogen in a liquid. So you can think of it, it is the power of the hydrogen, but the power of the hydrogen is determined by the amount of hydrogen. By hydrogen, I am referring to the H+ ion, and we'll quickly talk about ions. You have two types of ions, cations and anions. Cations are positively charged ions like H+, and anions are negatively charged ions like OH-. So both are subject to London dispersion forces, as we were talking about in that image with the water molecules, but they are, you can think of them as like charged particles, I think is the best way to go about it. So here we have two solutions. So in our first solution, we have a lot of H+ ions and a singular OH- ion, and then the opposite in the other solution. So pH, like I said, refers to the amount of hydrogen in a solution. So in our first solution, we have a lot of hydrogen. Now this is kind of like confusing, and I honestly don't know why they would make it like this, but a lot of hydrogen means there is a low pH, and a lot of OH- means there is a high pH. And this is all relative to a scale. So H+ ions and OH- ions combine to form hydrogen, to form water molecules like you saw on the first slide. So if you have an equal number of H+ and OH- ions in a solution, then you can group them and consider it even. Therefore, there will be a solid number of, or a whole number of water molecules. If that is the case, there is no, you can't say that there's more OH- or more H+ ions, and therefore it is stable, it's even. Stable, I think, is the best way to think about it. And looking at this pH scale, that would be right at the middle, 7, neutral water. So let's say in a solution you had one H+ and one one H+ and one OH- ion. Those ions would come together to form a water molecule, and your pH would be neutral. There would be, it wouldn't be basic and it wouldn't be acidic. So I didn't want to jump to those words, but kind of have to. So an acid is a number that's low on the pH scale, which means that it's got a lot of H+ ions. A base, in the scale, it's called an alkali, but a base is a number that's high on the pH scale, and it has a lot of OH- ions. Water is right at the middle. Pure water is right at the middle with a pH of 7. Generally, the water you drink is going to be ionized, which means it'll be either lower or higher on the pH scale than 7. But here you can see just some common liquids that and where they would fall on the pH scale. Surprisingly, and I found this really surprising, bleach is a very basic solution. I always considered it to be acidic, but no, it's actually basic. And this is really cool because you'd usually think of acids as something that could hurt you, but caution to everybody, no, you can't drink bleach. And that's the point I'm trying to make. You should never drink bleach. It's not a good idea. It will make you sick. It will be very detrimental to your body, which kind of proves the point that it's not just acids that are harsh. Everything is good in a moderate amount. I mean, you wouldn't really want to drink seawater either, would you? So, okay. So the relationship between pH and biology, I'm going to kind of zoom through this slide, but you guys can review it later, especially when you're doing the homework. But pure water has a distinct pH 7. Biological organisms require very specific conditions. Think of like temperature, light, sound. pH is one of those conditions. So if the pH is too high or too low, just like the temperature is too high or too low, it will affect the organism. The pH of the system determines whether or not a life form can survive, and our human blood is generally kept at a pH of 7.4. So if we lose the ability to regulate the pH of our bloodstream, it's very likely we'll die or at least develop severe medical problems. Yeah. So does anybody have any questions on pH or in general? I know I'm really over time and I'm super sorry about that. Yeah, do not drink bleach. Yeah, just don't do it. Don't do it. Tide Pods look appetizing, but don't do it. Anybody else? Okay, then I think that's all for today. Thank you all for coming and listening, and thank you to those of you who got the homework in. You can still submit it now, and I will look over it. But yeah, there's a new assignment, and I will see you next week. Okay, have a great week, guys. Bye.